Welcome to Nadir Audio. Today we're going to be taking a look at this excellent condition vintage Sherwood S-7250 CP receiver. So let's get started. So I first became aware of the Sherwood audio brand in the 80s when I subscribed to Stereo Review magazine as a teenager. And when they would talk about affordable amplification, there were two brands that would come up a lot, one of which was NAD and the other one was Sherwood. Now, at the time that I was subscribing to this magazine, I had already purchased my Kenwood receiver, which we reviewed on this channel. I think I got that in 1983, and it would be another 10 years or more before I'd be able to afford to upgrade that. So I sort of tucked those brand names in the back of my mind, thinking, well, if I have to upgrade down the road, maybe I'll look into those. In the 90s, I ended up kind of going down the Onkyo road in Integra, and then by the late 90s, I was into home theater and had a 5.1 setup. And it was around the year 2000 that a friend of mine was borrowing a vintage Sherwood from the CP range, and he had it paired with some fairly modest, I think they were Infinity Reference 3 speakers, but he played some jazz for me and was like, wow, this sounds a lot better than my main stereo, a lot better than any stereo I've had. And I had to agree with him, it sounded a lot better than my home theater stereo at the time, which I wasn't particularly happy with for music, although I liked it for home theater. So starting in the early 2000s, I went down the road of collecting these CP receivers on eBay. I think that they're a pretty good deal in comparison to some of the more desirable brands from the late 70s like Marantz or Pioneer. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sound signature in a minute. So this S-7250 CP receiver was the entry-level receiver in Sherwood's CP line, and that stood for Certified Performance. So there were 5 other receivers. This one is 20 watts per channel, but there also was a 30, a 45, a 60, an 80, and 100 watts per channel as you went up the line. And there were also separate preamplifiers and power amplifiers in this range. And for me, this is a real sweet spot for Sherwood. I really like the sound signature, and I prefer them to the solid-state units from the early 70s and also their solid-state units from the 80s. And again, I think that they're a really good deal. You can still find these in fairly good condition on eBay from time to time, and they're not super expensive. So one thing when you're talking about any gear from this era, there are certain things that it can't do compared to modern audiophile gear. So the first of which is imaging. This actually does image pretty well, but you're not going to get that laser-focused, precise imaging that you can get from some modern gear, even some, fairly inexpensive gear. Soundstage is similar. This has a nice soundstage, but you're not going to get the really big, full, life-size soundstage that you can from modern gear. And then just in terms of overall resolution, you're not going to get super high resolution to the point where you're getting tons of micro details and picking up things in recordings that you haven't necessarily heard before. Now, with all of that said, though, I think you can get a lot closer with this vintage gear than a lot of people realize. And a lot of that comes down to just specifically which ones you're choosing. So, for example, I mentioned my Kenwood receiver, which I'm fond of. I did like the way that sounds, and I still have it. But it's not in the same league as this Sherwood or the Mitsubishi amp that we're going to be comparing it to in this video. So overall, I really like this. This has kind of a warm sound that I really like. And it does actually have a bigger soundstage, maybe not quite as wide, but it's got some depth and height to it, which is unusual for gear from this time period that I really like. So let's talk about how we're going to compare it in this video. So before we talk about the sound, I thought I'd give you guys a quick peek at the inside of this unit. So unlike some of the other vintage units from the 80s that we featured on this channel, this one does have mostly discrete parts and good quality parts. You can see we have a healthy transformer over here. We've got our transistors here and a nice big beefy heatsink. And everything else is mostly discrete components, and I think that does contribute to the sound. Now we do have 3 bulbs here in the front. These light up the tuning dial. Unfortunately, one of them is burnt out, this one here on the left. The other 2 do work. I was hoping that I would be able to swap those out with some 1446 replacement bulbs I have that I've used in others, but these unfortunately are soldered in place. So I still could fix it at some point, but mostly what we need are the 2 bulbs on the right here, because those are right over the tuning dial, and so it works just fine without it, so I'm not going to bother replacing it at this time. One other thing I'll mention in here is that it's always a good idea to clean up the potentiometers, especially if you hear any crackling when you're moving the knobs on the front of the unit. And I typically just use deoxit. That's kind of the standard thing to use here, and it works really well. Fortunately, on this unit, you can't quite see here, but the potentiometers have easy access, and they all have a hole in the can, so it's really easy to just spray some in and move the dials around, and it works really well. So one other thing I'll mention here is that these units were mostly made in Japan, so they were made in the late 70s through 1980, but they did shift production to Korea in late 1979 and then 1980. This particular unit is a 1980 or late 79, and I know that because it says made in Korea on the back panel. But I've had a few of these receivers over the years, some from Japan, some from Korea. I haven't noticed a huge difference in quality or longevity. It really just comes down to the condition of the unit. The ones that I've had that are in really good condition, like this one, tend to just work. You just clean them up a little bit, plug them in, and they work. Some other ones I've had, like the phono preamp fail or different parts fail, but typically those were kind of road hard and put up wet type receivers. So that's my one recommendation. If you're trying to pick one up on eBay, try to get one that looks like it's in really good condition, because it's probably going to mean it has a better chance of everything fully functioning. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sound. So I used the Sherwood as my main amplifier for about a month. Then I started to do some A/B comparisons with my Mitsubishi DAR20, which is a slightly more powerful, I believe it's 50 watts per channel amplifier, also from 1980. Now, this is usually in my system, but I use it as a tuner only. I don't usually use it as an amplifier. So everything that I listened to for this video, they were all digital sources, and I was using my Chord Mojo 2 as the DAC for all of those. And then for the speakers, I've been using the Triangle Bro 3s, which actually work really well with this particular Sherwood, but better than the other speakers I had, so I stuck with these for the entire video. So the Sherwood and the Mitsubishi have very different sound signatures. So they're comparable in terms of overall resolution in imaging and soundstage. The Mitsubishi is a little wider soundstage, but the Sherwood is slightly deeper. But the sound profile is very different. So the Sherwood, as I had mentioned previously, has a slightly warm sound to it, a really nice mid-range. And the Mitsubishi is very much a more 80s sound. It's sort of a V curve with scooped mids. So the mid-range is a little bit lower than the high end and the low end. But also it's just a little less warm. It's kind of a cooler presentation. And in general, that's just not my personal preference. If I'm going one direction or another, I'd prefer it to be a little bit warm. And then the other issue with the Mitsubishi is that it does have a bump right in the sibilance range, which can be a little bit annoying, especially on recordings that have more than just a tiny bit of sibilance. So overall, if I was going to be using one of these as a primary amplifier, I could live with the Sherwood. I think it's actually quite good. The Mitsubishi just doesn't, it's not to my taste, but I think it could be quite good for somebody else. I do think that both of these amps are quite a bit ahead of my old Kenwood receiver and some of the cheaper receivers I've had from the 80s and 90s. So it really just boils down to what your personal preference is. So let's talk about some of the recordings I listened to and how that sort of played out. So I listened to a lot of recordings from the late 70s and early 80s, and one standout was Grace Jones' Warm Leatherette. I've always really liked the way this recording sounds, and the extra warmth that we get from the Sherwood really makes a difference here. It's really enjoyable to listen to, and it makes it really engaging. And it was a little bit less so on the Mitsubishi. And then also, I had mentioned the sibilance issue with the Mitsubishi. I had never noticed that there actually is some sibilance on the track Private Life, and I did notice that on the Mitsubishi, and I didn't notice it at all on the Sherwood. So Sherwood's definitely more forgiving for that sort of thing, and in general it sounded really good. I really like the way that the bass sounds, the drums. We got a nice soundstage, again not super precise, but it just seemed to sound right. It really seemed to fit this recording very well. And I found that true of other recordings from this era. So I think if you listen to a lot of these types of recordings, then the Sherwood could be a very good fit for your system. So I also listened to a few recordings from the late 90s. An example of that is this album TNT by Tortoise. This is a really nice sounding recording. And on this, it did sound very different on the Sherwood and the Mitsubishi, but it was less of a clear winner. So that more muscular sound on the Mitsubishi was kind of nice for some of the driving drums on this recording. Both of the amplifiers were able to capture some of that air around the recordings, maybe a tiny bit more in the Mitsubishi, but they both did a pretty good job there. But then again, the Sherwood gave you that little bit of extra warmth, where on this style of music, I think it fits really well. So on this one, I did slightly prefer the Sherwood, but it wasn't as clear of a win, and I found it to be similar for a lot of other sort of instrumental stuff I was listening to from the late 90s and early 2000s. So I did listen to a few jazz recordings as well, including Brilliant Corners by Thelonious Monk, and this is actually a very good sounding recording as well. And it did well on both of the amplifiers. The drum sound was nice. A lot of that sort of toe tapping and jump factor that you get on this recording was captured by both amplifiers. So really the differentiator here again was the warmth on the Sherwood, on the horns in particular. It just sounded really good. The horns were like into goosebump territory on the Sherwood. Not so much on the Mitsubishi, but it did pretty well. So I'd say that, if you're into good jazz recordings from, the 50s and 60s, either one of these amps would do well, but I think that the Sherwood fits that sound signature a little bit better. And lastly, I did listen to a few true audiophile recordings. I actually have purchased a few new ones in the last few months, and we'll be talking about those in upcoming videos. But for this video, we'll just talk about one of the old standards. We've talked about this a lot, but the Transcending Continents and Memories, which is on the MA Recordings label. And both of these receivers did pretty well. They don't necessarily get what I'd call micro details, but they get a lot of that resolution information, enough to make it really enjoyable to listen to, and that air around the instruments and kind of capturing the room sound. You can't get that with these vintage amplifiers. Now, again, the Sherwood is slightly more warm, and I prefer the slightly deeper soundstage on the Sherwood, so that gave me a slight nod on this particular recording. But again, I'd say that if you're into these true audiophile recordings, these vintage receivers, while they can do just fine, better than you would expect, that's probably not going to be what you want in the long term. You're going to want a more modern, highly resolving system with both amplification and speakers, so you can get all those micro details and really get everything that these kinds of recordings have to offer. But I did want to mention it because these do a lot better than you might imagine, and you can absolutely enjoy the good audiophile music listening on these types of amplifiers. So I'd say overall, I really like this Sherwood receiver. I'm going to be putting it in a system in a different room. It's not going to stay in the main system. But I'd say particularly if you're into recordings from the late 70s, early 80s, if that's kind of your sweet spot for what you're listening to, I think that, a lot of those recordings may have been mastered on similar amplification, and it just sounds right. It sounds really good. So for that kind of stuff, I think it's absolutely great. I do think that the Sherwood is also pretty forgiving. I didn't talk a lot in this video about some really challenged recordings. I did listen to some of that stuff, and the Sherwood is absolutely forgiving of that, and it doesn't have that sibilance problem that the Mitsubishi does, which helps in that regard. But yeah, overall, I would, as a vintage solid state, if you like sort of a warm solid state sound and you like recordings from that era, I think that this could be a really good amplifier for you, and I highly recommend it. But I think that's all in this one, guys. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.